I have to pay now, since they don't live there no more, and then another tenant is living there. The same thing, they're not paying, and the service is under their name. It has to go in their credit or against their name, not the owner of the house, which I made the tenant responsible. They have to pay for the trash, not the owner.
Two things. When you evicted your previous tenant, did they give you a security deposit, and that money you would use that to pay up their utilities had they not paid?
No, it cost me $2,000 more than the deposit to
I understand. Here's my recommendation to you is that you have all the trash put in your name, and then just increase the rent by about $30 a month to cover that charge. That would be the best way for you to do it. That way the tenant doesn't end up leaning your property for failing to pay.
Isn't it, maybe they don't have no trash. Maybe they don't want the service. Why does it have to be mandatory for them to have the trash service? It's where I live in other cities, it's not mandatory to have if you don't pay the trash company, they're not going to pick up your trash.
In our city, that's just how it works. And the problem is that if no one picks up the trash, then we have a sanitary and a health problem, and that risk is not a risk that our city is willing to take. The best thing is to do what Mr. Percival said and just to include it in your rent, and then it will just alleviate the problem. That's what most of the tenants do, or the landlords do now.
Now I know, but
But either way, if they would have moved out and left all of their trash that didn't get picked up because they didn't pay the bill, you would still have to be taking care of that trash.
Which I did.
Yeah. So,
which I did.
yeah.
And additionally, the Muni Code states the requirement of refuse services as well. So it's not a question of whether I want it or not. It's in the municipal code.
They have to have it.
That's correct.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. Now I'm going to raise the rent for like $30 for whatever the cost of the trash. But am I still responsible for the last tenant, which I didn't know that
Yes. But you can talk to CR&R, and they might work with you on that.
Okay.
They're real good about that. Just call them and work with them on that.
I did talk to them today. They said to come to the hearing.
Okay.
And now you can tell them you did come and you still have to talk to them.
Chris,
They may. You never know.
So we'll follow up, get your contact information, your address. Our Public Works Director can talk to you, and she'll get your information, and we'll follow up with you on that. Get you in contact with the right people. Okay?
Thank you.
Renee Basolo? Is that what it is? Okay.
So I had a similar issue, right? And clearly, this is not the first time this has come to your council. And I'm probably going to lose because you guys have made up your minds about this and you have the law that you wrote. So that's going to be difficult, but let me try to win this, okay? So about 4 or 5 years ago, I rented my house to Mr. Gaspar, and Mr. Gaspar lived there quite contentedly for about 4 years. I currently live there now. Mr. Gaspar decided to make a mess of his life, and that took a long time. I lost some rent money trying to give Mr. Gaspar a shot. And then when he left not only this trash bill, but he left lots of trash that wouldn't be picked up by the trash company. So Mr. Gaspar has left me with a bit of a bill beyond this. So I'm prepared to take my lumps. That's the way it is, right? I mean, that was my responsibility. I rented to Mr. Gaspar. The way I see it is that Mr. Gaspar made a contract with CR&R. I didn't make the contract with them. He made the contract with them. The bill came in his name monthly. Mr. Gaspar paid that bill monthly for 4 years or more. It was his contract, not mine. In addition, I did do a little bit of reading, and it says that the reason that you've instituted the rule that you have to have trash is because the house is inhabitable if there's trash all over the place. That makes sense. But it also makes sense that the house is not habitable if it doesn't have running water and a water heater to heat it and gas to heat the water heater and electricity to light the building at night. It's not habitable with all those things. And yet, I haven't received a bill from the city water department, I haven't received a bill from the electric company, and I haven't received a bill from the gas company. It seems to me that CR&R has gotten the city to do its business for it, to collect its debts, rather than it's a private company, I imagine. I don't think it isn't your company. I mean, I've seen CR&R trucks all over Orange County and maybe even Los Angeles County, I don't know. So it's a private company. But they've got a private company that has got the city of Hammond collecting its debts, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense. I understand you want trash picked up, and I get that. But I'm just about finished, but what I'd say is this. I'm willing to take my lumps on Mr. Gaspar. Mr. Gaspar cost me a bit of money. I'm sure the water department is taking their lumps, the electric company is taking their lumps, and the gas company is taking their lumps, and I would like CNR and R to take their lumps. Thank you. Where's that lead me, though? I mean, am I stuck with this, or are you going to refer me to the right people at CR&R?
Chris Jensen, our Public Works Director, can follow up with you, get your contact information. Chris Jensen, the one with their hand raised.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I have no more requests. Okay. So I'll close the public hearing. Any other discussion on this item? That may have a, Mike, did you?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. And it kind of goes back to the comment that I made to the first gentleman that spoke. And this goes out to not just the folks here in the audience, but everybody that has a rental property in the city of Emmett, to save yourself this headache, I would recommend that figure out what the cost is for trash on a monthly basis, contact CR&R and get that trash put in your name, and then just add that to your rent that you charge, just to prevent this from having a tenant get a lien put on your house if they fail to pay. I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay. May I have a motion?
Well, I move to approve resolution bill number 19-043.
Second. Please vote. That passes 5-0.
Thank you, council.
Thank you, Lorena. Next item is item number 10, discussion action item, approval of resolution approving the FY 2019-20 City of Emmett operating budget. Yes.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. What's being passed out at the dais is the copy of the PowerPoint. You should have a copy of this in your email as well. I provided a PDF in your email. We've had just some minor adds to the budget in terms of narrative information for the public, but I wanted to provide an overview based on what we discussed on June 11th to where we are now, where we are asking you to adopt the resolution and adopt the budget for fiscal year 19-20. So the budget process so far, and apologies if this is reminiscent of the last council meeting, but this was the foundation that I pulled from for this presentation. The budget process started in March of 2019. The direction was given from the city manager to prepare a rollover budget at that time. Excuse me. The Budget Ad Hoc Committee, made up of Mayor Wright as well as Councilmember Krupa, met on January 28th, February 25th, March 25th, April 23rd, April 30th, May 23rd, and May 27th. The Measure U Committee met twice on April 29th and May 28th. The council hosted workshops on March 27th as well as May 14th and provided direction on the fiscal year 1920 budget policy items on the May 14th meeting. During the time of the budget process, we reviewed all expenditures and revenues with management. So what I mean by that is each department head, each division manager, we met with their team, went over their year-to-date expenditures for the current fiscal year, as well as historical expenditures for the last 3 years to get an idea as to where the trends were at, whether line items needed to be adjusted or whether there was any other changes that needed to be made in terms of personnel in each operation. And then finally, on June 11th, the council did receive the proposed preliminary budget on June 11th, and we did have a conversation that evening about any changes or items of concern for the council. So if we rewind back to May 14th, I provided a presentation on the budget and I asked for some direction on a few policy items related to the budget that are incorporated in this fiscal year's budget. The first item was the use of Measure U funds above the $10 million mark. The council provided direction to explore that option, so that is one of the items that we've included. Did you have a question, Mayor? For public safety and only for public safety in the general fund. Allocation of 72% of general fund revenues to public safety budgets. This is taken out of Measure Resolution 4731 and 4703 that specifies this requirement. The council directed me to explore that option. The lowering of the 20% emergency reserve, that is something that collectively council unanimously did not want me to explore or utilize. So for the sake of this year's budget, we have not touched the 20% reserve. And we had a conversation about special events funding. We've included the allocation for this fiscal year, but we will need to have continuing discussions related to the operational issues that creates for our departments in terms of overtime and additional staffing that's needed to bring staff in on the weekends to provide those services to the community and these organizations in the community. Additionally, this slide mentions some of the items that are included in the state audit. The council asked for direction or more information on development impact fees and what that means for the community. But for the balance of the items, the council directed me to explore those items and bring forward items as needed to the council for further direction as it relates to policy items. As I mentioned, the Measure U Oversight Committee met twice on April 29th as well as May 28th. The letter is attached to the backup, so you have that in the agenda backup. The committee collectively agreed that the planned expenditures for fiscal year 1920 meet the intentions of resolutions 4703 and 4731. They recommended that the city use Measure U reserves to increase visibility of public safety operations. I'll get into the balance of Measure U funds that have accrued. They requested that the council consider use of some of those funds to help bolster public safety and the visibility of those items in the community. And then finally, they recommended that the city explore the use of midterm financing for capital purchases that are programmed for this fiscal year. So there's a number of items that we've included in this fiscal year's budget. In terms of highlights, I've included them on this slide. We've included an allocation for a facilitator for strategic planning sessions. We've included costs for recruitment for a permanent city manager. We've included an allocation for Measure Z implementation. We've included an allocation for a classification and compensation study as stated in the public safety MOUs. We've included cost increases for PERS, increases for contracts for software maintenance, increases in contract costs for the Simpson Center, new positions including the deputy city clerk, the HR analyst, and the management analyst. I should mention that the new positions in HR and finance, which are the subsequent items to the budget, are a result of the consolidation of existing positions with no net increase in the number of personnel. So largely elimination of some positions to create those positions with no number of personnel added. New budget allocation for overtime in police and fire. Compensatory time included as an expenditure line item in the police department. $1.2 million of Measure U funding for public safety in the general fund and only public safety. Cost increases for public safety MOUs. We've included a 20% emergency reserve. And then finally, we've restored education and training budget levels to the levels that they were previously. You'll recall that in fiscal year 2018-2019, the current fiscal year, as part of the budget balancing measures, we halved, reduced by half the education and training budgets for all departments, and so we've restored that to the levels as what they were to fiscal year 17-18. So there's a number of items that we have not included in the proposed fiscal year 19-20 budget, and I've listed these for the council and the public on the side. Cost of living adjustments for non-safety personnel have not been included. Classification and compensation studies for non-safety personnel have not been included. The replacement of the telephone system, a purchase of an agenda management system is not included. Private security for the library or city hall is not included. Consolidated grant management is not included. Proactive mobile home inspection staff is not included. An economic development program, not included. Additional capacity and code enforcement is not included. And then finally, additional contract capacity and code enforcement is not included there. It's a duplicate of the previous one, so apologies for that. So you'll recall at the beginning, probably around May, we had conversations about the projected deficit for this fiscal year. It was projected at approximately $5.2 million, and so we've been able to eliminate that deficit, and this summarizes the way that we've been able to eliminate that deficit. We eliminated 5 non-safety vacant positions. These positions have been vacant for quite some time. The assistant civil engineer, part-time office specialist in engineering, an HR technician, office specialist, and technician in HR, and a facilities technician were eliminated. Utilization of $891,000 in fund balance from equipment replacement. This is funding that had been allocated for police and fire over the course of a number of years. The utilization of that fund balance was utilized to shore up the budget deficit. Utilization of $315,000 of fund balance from facilities maintenance projects, projects that have not been started in numerous years. I should mention that in the discussions that we had with our departments, there were discussions about the projects that we were scheduled to either get started in this fiscal year or projects that had not been started as a result of being rolled over for a number of years. And so this is when these items came to light in terms of projects that had not been moved forward on. And so we utilized that to help shore up the deficit. Additionally, $500,000 of fund balance from workers' compensation. I mentioned last time that we get a quote for workers' compensation around this time, which assumes personnel or all the personnel that we have in our budget is staffed, but we know that we're going to have vacancies throughout the year. So when we get our final invoice, we get the actual true cost based on the number of employees. And over the course of a number of years, we've accrued a balance because our final invoices come in lower than the projected proposed amount that we get right now. Utilization of $200,000 from the liability fund. And then finally, a 5% vacancy savings factor across non-safety departments. I mentioned we've got a number of vacancies throughout the agency. We feel that 5% is a pretty modest vacancy savings factor, and so we're comfortable with including that as a result of natural attrition, people that leave the agency, and so we're comfortable with that dollar amount there. Additionally, we have a number of vacancies in the police department, currently 19 vacancies in the police department on the general fund side, primarily of sworn officers, boots on the ground. In conversations with our police chief, we anticipate hiring 10 officers, resulting in 9 vacancies. And so those 9 vacancies, it's a realistic and honest number as to the number of individuals we can hire this year. And so that's a very aggressive goal. I have the confidence in Chief Webb in getting to that number. Even though we may hire 10, I should point out, we will have individuals that leave the agency due to retirements, laterals from our agencies that go to other agencies, or disciplinary action that happens, and officers will no longer be on the force. That will have a net impact, or that will have an impact on the net positions we add. So it's a constant battle. It may be 19 vacancies today, but it could be 21, it could be 22 in just a matter of a couple weeks. So that's a fluctuating number. It's subject to change at any given moment. Elimination of $530,000 for equipment replacement in fiscal year 19-20. You'll recall that in fiscal year 18-19, the current budget year that we're in right now, we eliminated that, and that is the investment in terms of replacement of equipment for this fiscal year. We have not included that for this fiscal year for the general fund outside of Measure U. We've utilized $1.2 million of Measure U funding to offset costs in the general fund. The bulk of costs related to retention and attraction have been absorbed primarily by the general fund. Increases in overtime and personnel costs in public safety have been primarily absorbed by the general fund and will help offset these costs. And so, as you'll recall, the MOU state, as a result of how Bradley Burns trends, we do have to provide for increases if we do see increases in Bradley Burns. That is primarily absorbed by the general fund, and so the $1.2 million that we've proposed to use will be used to cover some of those costs, as well as some of the increases in costs that we've seen for public safety and only public safety in the general fund. So I've included a synopsis of Measure U and some background on that. I'll go ahead and read it aloud. The voters of the City of Hemet approved Measure U, which was a 1% transaction and use tax to be used for general municipal services for the City of Hemet in 2016. Once approved, a 1 cent per dollar tax was levied on the sale of all tangible personal property purchased from any retailers within the City of Hemet. Proceeds of the tax were to be deposited in the city's general fund and subject to the same independent annual audit as other general fund revenue. The Oversight Committee is primarily tasked with 2 items, and those items are in the italics. The Citizens Oversight Committee shall annually review and report on 1, the city's proposed and actual expenditure of proceeds generated by the transaction and use tax, and 2, the independent annual audit required under this article. The committee's report shall be submitted to the City Council for review and discussion at a noticed public meeting of the City Council and shall be made available to the public at least 5 business days prior to such public meeting. The Measure U report is included in your agenda backup. So now we'll talk about the proposed expenditures of Measure U that's included in the budget document. For the police department, we have ongoing costs of approximately $6.0 million, and that's a continuation of the staffing that we currently have, other items in that area as well. We will be adding 2 community service officers, 3 new vehicle requests, 2 public safety operators, and an IT technician to help with public safety IT needs, primarily in the police department, for a total of $6.6 million of Measure U police expenditures. There are other purchases that we will be utilizing fund balance, Measure U fund balance, to purchase a software upgrade of about $134,000 and a radio system replacement of approximately $1.3 million. That's critically important to our public safety operations, and that's something that both chiefs are committed to taking care of in this fiscal year, for a total of $1.5 million of fund balance expenditures for Measure U. So total Measure U expenditures for the police department are $8.1 million for this fiscal year. I should note too that in the Measure U committee's recommendation, they do mention the use of midterm financing instead of an outright purchase. And so you'll see that we've plugged in $1.3 million for the radio system replacement. The assumption there is that we outright purchase it with a cash purchase right there. If we were to finance it, obviously that frees up some of that $1.3 million to utilize for other things in public safety for Measure U. So that's one thing that we can explore if the council desires. On the fire department side, they've got ongoing expenditures of approximately $2.2 million. We've programmed a West Covina CAD RMS maintenance agreement of $60K, $78,000 for a public safety call taker, one fire apparatus type 1 engine company, $200,000, personal protective equipment of $60,000, and self-contained breathing apparatus of $400,000, for a total of $3 million of Measure U fire expenditures. The fire department will be utilizing some fund balance to pay for the radio system. The portion for the fire department that they will be covering for the radio system is pegged at approximately $600,000. Total Measure U expenditures for the fire department total $3.6 million. And I should note that the concept related to financing for capital becomes critically and crucially important as it relates to some of the vehicles that the fire department should be replacing in the near term. So that really opens up another opportunity for us to look at in terms of what we can do in replacing much needed equipment in the fire department. So total Measure U expenditures for the items for the police department and the fire department total $11.7 million for public safety. So this is a really significant investment that the city of Hemet will be making in its public safety departments. I had the privilege to speak at an event last week, and I mentioned the amount of investment that's programmed and proposed to be allocated for this year's public safety departments, and that's pretty remarkable. It's clear that public safety is one of the top priorities for the city of Hemet, and it's clearly shown in the investment of approximately $11.7 million. I should note that as of, we're projecting approximately at the end of this fiscal year, given the remaining revenues that we're slated to receive, as well as the expenditures that we anticipate to expend in the next week, we anticipate having a fund balance of Measure U funding of $10.5 million. You can see what I've included in the table below are actual revenues for fiscal year 17-18, which approximately $11.1 million, and the actual expenditures for fiscal year 17-18, $5.3 million. So based on the revenues that we receive and our expenditures in fiscal year 17-18, you can see the difference between $11.1 million in revenues and $5.3 million in expenditures. That's what helps build up that Measure U fund balance. You can see actual revenues fiscal year 18-19 year to date, $7.9 million. We still have some revenues to receive on that. Our projections are slated to still be at the $11.2 million mark. Actual expenditures year to date, about $6.1 million. So you can see that there is a difference in the revenues that we've received as well as the expenditures, and this is typical. Again, that difference helps get that $10.5 million fund balance in Measure U. I should mention again, reiterate, that the planned expenditures for Measure U, based on what the committee's report stated, the expenditures meet the intentions of resolutions 4703 and 4731. They recommend that the city use Measure U reserves to increase visibility of public safety operations. That's that $10.5 million. And then finally, they recommended that the city explore the use of midterm financing for capital purchases, again, either for equipment in police and fire, as well as the radio communication system. So I should mention that in addition to the planned expenditures that were on the previous slide, the proposed fiscal year 1920 budget includes an allocation of $1.2 million to support the police and fire departments in the general fund based on direction provided by the City Council on May 14, 2019. The $1.2 million will be utilized to fund cost increases, including PERS increases, employee retention expenses, operation and maintenance costs, and overtime expenses that have grown over the course of the last few years. If police and fire expend 100% of the Measure U proposed expenditures that are included in the budget document for fiscal year 1920, and with the use of $1.2 million for public safety costs in the general fund for Measure U, we anticipate a fund balance of approximately $8.8 million for the end of this fiscal year. So with the planned expenditures that we've included, which total about $12.9 million, if we were to completely expend those planned expenditures, we think by the end of this fiscal year we project about $8.8 million left of Measure U funding for this fiscal year. If you go back a couple slides, you'll see that our revenues come in and our expenditures aren't a one-for-one on there. That's what's building up that fund balance. And so we will do our best in expending all of those funds for this fiscal year, but that assumption assumes 100% of that funding gets expended out of the public safety departments. So when we add up the ongoing expenditures as well as the capital purchases as well as fund balance expenditures, we get a total of $12.9 million expenditures for Measure U and only for public safety for this fiscal year. So with the use of those items and some of the items I talked about earlier, we have been able to close the deficit and provide a balanced budget and maintain a 20% reserve for the mayor and the city council's review and discussion. For fiscal year 1920, the bulk of our revenues are projected to remain relatively flat with some very slight increases across specific line items. It's absolutely imperative that the management team continue to monitor the economic trends throughout the region and also at a broader level. So some of the items that the management team will be doing over the course of the next fiscal year, we really need to start looking at modeling out for our financials in terms of revenues and expenditures. We know that there are going to be increases that will happen year after year, so we need to be able to project those out so that the council has the information related to what those costs are going to be in a few years so that we can better suit and better manage the operation and provide that operation to the council as well as the public. We need to look at the fiscal solvency of the city of Hemet, not only on the general fund, but also on the Measure U side. So the original Measure U plan and projections didn't account for the MOU increases, didn't account for the PERS increases, and those increases we know are going to happen. And so we need to really look at those again and start projecting out again, doing some financial modeling to make sure that we're in the position where we can, without a doubt, be confident in our ability to maintain fiscal solvency for the city of Hemet. It's of the utmost importance. I should note that in fiscal year 16-17, that was the fiscal year where the voters of Hemet approved Measure U. The city had utilized reserves to balance the budget. And so you'll recall I talked about a 20%, the fund balance above the 20% reserve, largely as a result of the revenues associated with the sale of the refuse operation. That's really what's been keeping the city of Hemet continuing on and maintaining expenditures at the current levels. So just the very fact that in fiscal year 16-17, when Measure U was adopted, that we needed to use fund balance to shore up the budget shows that there were some budget issues that were going on at that time. And again, it's critically important that we move forward, the management team moves forward with the direction provided by the council on May 14th, 2019. So I wanted to go over a couple of items that we talked about on the June 11th meeting and provide some information related to some of the things that we've done since June 11th and some of the things that we still need to do moving forward. There was one change in the city manager's office. The executive assistant was changed to an executive analyst position in the city manager's office. I think I've conveyed to most of all of you that the analytical capacity that we need to move forward on some of the things that we need to improve upon in our operation is really suited more for an analyst type individual. And so instead of having an executive assistant, I'd really like to see an executive analyst provide some of the customer service help that the council really can appreciate, the public can appreciate, but also lend me some support in getting some of the analytical work that I do primarily on my own. I can use the analysts and have them do the work and relieve some of or add some capacity in our operation. On June 11th, the council directed me to look at what we could do to look at the city attorney's costs. I've had preliminary conversations about this, but it's going to require more time. We will need to examine opportunities including in-house staff attorneys, shifting workload around, as well as reviewing other options. And so I've already had some conversations with Eric. I've had some conversations with some of our management team too. 2-week turnaround was couldn't provide anything of substance in that time, but it's something that we will continue to look at and explore and really provide some valuable options for the council to weigh in and consider. And then finally, as you'll notice, and this is thanks to the finance team, Lorena and her staff, we've included some new information in the document. And so we really wanted to have this for the public's edification so that they knew some of the backstory or some of the background on some of the items in the budget. So you'll see that we've included information related to understanding the budget document, information related to fund structures, information related to the description of the city's funds, information on the budget process and how it all works, information related to our major revenue sources, and then finally we will have additional worksheets, not anything related to change of numbers or anything, but just more information so that the public could have information and get a better grasp as to what is in the budget document. Because you get an average individual, average resident, you look at a 300, 400 page document, and it's a lot to take in. And so our goal with that is to try and make it as informational as possible, educate the public as well as to what's going on there. And so we will be adding some things in the budget document, not to change the substance, but just add more information in the budget document. So we will be finalizing that in the near term. So with that being said, I'm happy management team here is also here to answer any questions you may have for us.
First, I'd like to ask, do we have any speakers' requests?
Not at this time, thank you.
Thank you. Then we'll go on to council. Do we have any questions from council? Okay.
I just got
Sure. One question.
Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for all the work you and all the department heads have put into this year. Really appreciate it. On the police and fire public safety, into the Measure U funding for the radio system, the total cost for that radio system is $2 million, with 1.6 coming from police and 1.3 from police and 600,000 from fire, correct?
That's correct.
So if we were looking at any type of financing for that, it would be for the $2 million figure.
That's correct.
Okay, that was my only question. Thank you.
As far as our accounting software, is that not included?
So there is an allocation, and Lorena can probably speak to this, but we have some funding that's been set aside over the course of the last few years for that purchase and to move forward with that. So we have that.
Michael? Okay. Russ? Okay. And looking to piggyback on what Linda added or asked with regards to the radio system replacement, I think it really would be prudent for us to look into the financing of that system and not outlay the $2 million. So we look forward to you looking into that option and coming back to council. And
Absolutely.
As far as the city attorney's budget, I know that it's a big increase from the previous year. Is there some explanation as to that increase, and should the council really think about maybe an RFP for attorney services and maybe hiring an in-house attorney to supplement the day-to-day stuff, and then utilize outside counsel for some of the bigger stuff as they arise, as a way to look at cost cutting? Because I've looked at the budgets for other cities that have bigger budgets than we do, and their city attorney's costs are a lot less than ours. Now, mind you, I've seen some that have a much bigger city attorney cost, but their budgets are a lot larger than ours, and they can afford it. So is that something that we should be really looking into this year? And I know that the council in previous years has made the comment about institutional knowledge about Hemet. Sometimes I think that could be a bad thing, and we should maybe have a fresh set of eyes looking at things moving forward with the city to make sure that we're still cutting edge with the changes in the way California has become over the last several years. And when I say several, I mean like 15, 20 years, how California has evolved. Your thoughts on that?
So two things. The increase in the attorney's budget for this fiscal year was largely as a result of the process that we went through. So examining all expenditures across all of our operations and providing a realistic idea of what we expect to expend for this upcoming fiscal year. And so we looked at the expenditures in the attorney's budget, and that's how we've included that allocation as to what it is, because it's really rooted in the historical trends of what we're seeing versus a number that was artificially lower than what we're actually seeing. So that's why we've included that number there. The second item, if the council desires that, obviously we will do what the council desires. So some of the conversations related to having in-house staff attorneys probably is worthy of a discussion. I know when it comes to some of the litigation related to use of force or some of those other items that you are all familiar with, typically that's, you don't have a lot of in-house staff personnel that take on that type of responsibility just because it is a specialized expertise. But, whatever the council desires is what we will do.
I have a question along those lines too. As far as for our city attorney staff, I think we're going to be spending like 1.5 this year, so 1.3 won't even cover it. And what do we do to staff directors that go over budget? You know what I'm saying? They're required to come back and cut here to cover it there. And so that's not fair. It's not fair for what we do.
I think we all agree that the city attorney's budget is certainly more than what we'd like to see, or more than we can manage comfortably by any means. And for what, for his base fee, which covers everything outside of litigation, pretty much outside of litigation, I don't know that's unreasonable. If you compare that to an in-house city attorney and what you would pay for benefits and everything else, plus, perhaps almost that much in a base salary to begin with. I think our biggest problem, again, is the litigations we have. Now, how we get around that, I don't know. I have no problem with going out for an RFP by any means, personally myself, as far as seeing, you can't make decisions on having half of the information or not being educated as to what's really out there, who would be willing to provide that service at a lesser cost. So I don't have a problem with going out for an RFP at all. I think every couple of years you need to do that. But
I just think we need to change the way we're doing it. I mean, this particular agenda on page 17, we have the list of which this agenda looks great, by the way. Thank you. We have our warrants list, and our attorney check in here is for $143,396.49. So there's two different accounts that is charged to. So the professional services account is the almost $33,000 amount, which is our retainer fee, right? So we're almost up to $400,000 a year for our retainer fee. So that's reasonable, right? That would be reasonable. Our litigation fees are over $110,000. And I mean, we just can't sit up here and give lip service, because we're trying to get our city in a better financial position. So we send our trees contract out. I mean, we could stop trimming trees in our city, and you know how much we would save? Besides the LMDs, we would save $300,000. And if we get somebody else to do it cheaper, we're going to save about $50,000, $75,000. But here, we have no problems spending 1.5, and so that blows my mind. And we can't, if we're looking to make this better, we've got to make it better.
so what are you suggesting?
I think that we need to have a different setup. I mean, I think tonight was a good example in our closed session meeting. We get our reports, our litigation reports, right? We get our litigation reports. And we were told that a certain amount has already been spent on this item that has not been on a litigation report yet. That amount was unacceptable in my eyes to be decided and spent before who gets to decide. And so having a variation, having a different setup, that would be like, and sorry, Chief, I'm going to just throw out a funny example, but that would be like our fire chief deciding what fires he's going to respond to and which ones we're not, and he gets a bonus for the ones we respond to. You know what I'm saying? So there's a little bit of a conflict there. So if do you see what I mean? You don't get to decide, hey, we're going to give you litigation, so we're going to give you another job. So if we give him jobs and he gets paid like on a bonus for every fire he does, then he's going to pick all these fires and get bonuses. He doesn't get to give himself a raise, is what I'm saying. And in our attorney fees, he's not giving himself a raise, but he's giving work to his company. And so if there were a different type of setup that, we could keep him on the retainer. I don't have a problem with that. The $400,000 seems very reasonable. Where we get into litigation, maybe we need to have someone in between deciding things before it goes to litigation. So it just needs to be different. I mean, our trend, we go up, and then we cry about it, and so then it comes down a little, and then we go up, and now we are back to the peak again.
And again, when the retainer fee has not changed for a number of years, I can only see that, or it tells me then, it's based, the expenditures then have been based on the number of litigation cases we have. So is
And
what.
he decides what goes to that level, because just tonight, we found out that something has, we've paid out this amount, and we knew nothing about it. And so,
I get what
who
you're
is
saying.
monitoring this?
Yeah, I get what you're
We
saying.
need someone that is monitoring that.
There's not really a check for the balance.
Right. No, I get it, I get it.
So, I mean, if we want to pass this budget tonight, I mean, I would be okay passing it, but we need to put like an amount on, yeah. And I would say, you know, we're going to put $700,000 in the attorney budget for now until we decide what we're going to do. That'll get them through half the year. But we need to do something different. And we can't just say, oh, we'll bring it back. Let's approve the 1.5 or 1.2 or whatever and bring it back. We mean business. Everybody else had to tighten their belt. I think we need to do something different.
Russ, did you have anything to add? Or questions?
I did, but I lost
Is that something we could do, is to change the allocation for the city attorney, reduce it to $750,000 pending what we've already asked you to go out and look at and have discussions and go forward? And admittedly, we've had a lot of litigation, especially with the marijuana dispensaries and that type of thing, and that has really added to the cost on this. But is that something that could realistically be done to change that number to $750,000 and revisit that?
Yeah, I think the council could do that. I think the larger question in terms of what that strategy would be, what that looks like in terms of what the council's comfortable with, that's going to require obviously some work on our part to look into. The mayor is absolutely right. The retainer has stayed the same. It's the litigation that's really causing that increase in the attorney's budget. Given the way things are now, I don't imagine that the lawsuits will get any lower. Just the way things are, and we can certainly explore that. That would just require some an answer, some sort of recommendation, some sort of solution before that line item obviously gets expensed. Yeah.
And I really don't have like a plan in mind. I think that we have to work with what's best for our city. But I think that, like Mike's worded it the best, is we need a better checks and balance for that somehow. But I think that leaves it open enough for him to research. And I mean, the city attorney doesn't work for Chris.
Oh, he works for us. But I think that would give us the momentum that would always be before us, that there's a $750,000 limit, and that we need to be very cognitive of that, and we need to work in the direction of seeing where, and I'll say if, we can bring this down to a lesser amount.
Yeah, and if I know that we've got the $400,000 for the retainer, is that the math that works out in terms of the balance being? Yeah, I guess it would. Yeah.
Unless we're only budgeting for 6 months.
Yeah, the math. I just did the math in my head.
What'd you say? We're budgeting for what?
Ryan, what'd you say?
We assume we're only budgeting for 6 months.
That's correct.
Can you repeat what she said?
So essentially, we would be budgeting it for 6 months. Mm-hmm.
And that would give us time to.
I don't have a problem with
Evaluate
that.
and figure it out.
At that point, then we do a midterm adjustment, 6 months adjustment.
Or sometime sooner before then.
But the commitment to make a change, because they have to do that. Because it
And,
will be there.
and so with that being said, is that, RFP, is there specific parameters that you're looking at in terms of the change? What is it that the council desires when it comes to that?
We went for an RFP 2 years ago, and in fact, I think I still have all of them. So I would assume that purchasing has all of the guidelines and parameters that we looked at that particular point.
And I don't
Because it
even
hasn't
know
been
like,
that long
if
yet.
RFP is exactly what, because the
RFQ,
400,000.
I think, is
Right. It's for services, so,
It would be an RFP at this time.
okay. But the $400,000 is fine if we are going to, but we just need to structure put in a
It's
checks and
more
balances.
a policy decision as to how we decide, or how it's decided, and at what point things are going to go to litigation. Of course, when somebody comes in with a lawsuit, you have to
Have a
address
choice.
it one way or the other. So,
Well, and looking at costs for some in-house services, whatever, I know there are a few cities around that have their own legal fees, or legal people in-house that handles whatever, and they do have outside sources for major litigation or whatever. So I think those are options that, sorry to put more on your shoulders for looking at things, but I think those are options we need to look at.
Yeah, and the reason I bring up the RFP is because if we start looking at, okay, let's look at maybe some in-house staff, attorney functions, portions of it that we can do internally, what impact does that have on a retainer? So at that point, that would create some issues related to, okay, what are we going to do with the rest of the things that could potentially not be covered by a retainer?
it doesn't hurt to explore.
No. And depending
I
on,
feel like
we need to give him
Yeah.
more direction, but be creative and come back up with some options to us. Yeah. Depending on what happens with the Measure Z. And maybe research
issue.
some other
Who
cities
knows?
and with our upcoming needs, and you could kind of maybe make a presentation to us.
So is there anything specific that the council would like in terms of?
Lower bill.
And if I may, only because Eric isn't here, I do want to just reiterate that he has been working really close with Chris and with Lorena in finance, and is very open to exploring different options and continuing to do that work. So it's not something that the city attorney's office is opposed to by any means.
Yeah, and I appreciate Stephanie bringing that up. I think it was the Wednesday right after the council meeting that we had where we talked about some of those items. And Eric has conveyed, obviously, the concerns that the council has. He heard that. I heard that. So we started working on what those potential opportunities could be. And so, yeah, Eric did hear that loud and clear as well.
Well, I think it's noteworthy that the retainer fee has been fairly constant. That's indicative to me of an effort being made by the city attorney's office to control costs. The reality is we live in a very litigious society, more so in California perhaps than other states. And that's the X factor that drives things up. But I'm certainly open to looking at a process of review. One of the things, and maybe Stephanie can address this, one of the things that I think plays into looking at controlling litigation costs is when legal action is brought forward, there are timelines that have to be met to comply with court orders or subpoenas or any of the legal processes that may not align themselves with counsel's ability to be briefed on a particular incident or issue in a timely manner to give direction to that. So there's a lot of moving parts to this that I think we just need to be mindful of. I wholeheartedly support the idea of looking at a new way to do things. One of the thoughts that just occurred to me while we're sitting here is, I don't know if this has been explored before, but there's a lot of joint powers agreements between government institutions for dealing with shared expenses that we all have. And so maybe some form of a JPIA with sharing expenses between similar cities for legal services might be something that we could look at. I just think, we need to keep a clear understanding of the things that impact the fluctuating costs that we can't control, and recognize that there are constraints, time-wise and whatnot, that we need to factor into it too. But I'm certainly not opposed to looking at options. And I think